Hey everyone, it is August 1, 2013. I'm Rene Ritchie, and today we are going to talk all the Apple and iOS news of the week. This is the iMore Show. Joining me, as always, is the managing editor of iMore and all-around Mac and gaming savant, Peter Cohen. How are you?
Great, Rene. How are you doing?
I like how I threw that fancy French word at you. You didn't even flinch.
That's true. Yeah. No, I'm good with French.
We're using Google Hangouts now because I destroyed the Skyposaurus, and they put your face at the bottom, and I feel impolite not looking at it. But then I'm looking down and not looking up at our audience, which makes me doubly impolite. So I'm caught. I don't know what to do.
Just go with whatever feels right, man.
So, I mean, it's been an interesting week, and the news has been everywhere. So I want to start with maybe some of the stuff that happened today and work our way back. And I know some of it is of interest because you and I share similar interests about how Apple is misreported, misunderstood, and generally misrepresented in the media. And I was talking to Mark Gurman about this earlier, who was on our show last week, and it doesn't seem to me like this should be so hard because Apple's been around for a long time. As you're fond of saying, their past behavior quite often indicates their future behavior. They operate within the laws of physics and economics, and yet over and over again, these stories get reported that in no way reflect Apple as a company. Forget sources, rumors, inside information that defy simple logic, Peter, and it's increasingly flabbergasting to me.
Yeah, and it used to be limited to the tech blogosphere, and from that perspective, I guess the damage was pretty limited. But the problem is that a lot of this stuff now is picked up by mainstream publications because, mainstream news services, whether they're cable TV or newspapers or mainstream websites, have seen the same sort of bump in traffic every time they report on Apple that the tech blogs have, so they've followed suit. And unfortunately, their understanding of Apple and their ability to report Apple objectively is no better than a lot of the tech blogs. So they will do whatever they can, I guess, to get the page views, to get the people watching, to get the people talking about their stories, and, the truth be damned.
Yeah, so I will get rid of this quickly because it was only interesting to me in terms of, and I called the story lies, damn lies, and sloppy statistics, but Google had their Nexus 7 announcement, and it looks like an interesting device. Looks way better than the original Nexus 7. It addresses a lot of the problems I had with the original Nexus 7, but during the presentation they announced, based on the metrics of some analytics company, that the Nexus 7 outsold the iPad in Japan. And I really don't care about sales numbers. I report them begrudgingly even when they involve Apple. I care much more about quality of device, who's making the best stuff than who's making the most stuff. But it was interesting to me because it just got reported, and then I forget who it was who went and looked into it. The name escapes me right now, but I'll put a link in the show notes. And it turns out that that is only if you don't count Apple stores or other retail outlets in the equation. And to me, that's just another example of reporting a story negatively on Apple for the attention rather than taking 3 seconds, reading the story, and see if it makes sense to you before you pass it on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and this is the problem, is that, a lot of the old rules of journalism about having, secondary sources to back up your information kind of went out when everybody started demanding content right away. And I don't even know what to say, Rene, about it. It just seems kind of crazy to me that we are so focused on that quick hit that we've let some of the basic rules of this profession kind of go by the wayside. And admittedly, you and I are going to see things from a slightly skewed perspective because we're biased towards Apple. We're going to want to give Apple the benefit of the doubt, but unfortunately, a lot of people just don't care, and they just keep going with it no matter where the truth is.
So as a longtime Mac follower, I don't have to tell you this, but just for the benefit of our audience, one of the reasons I don't like these numbers is that they're fairly meaningless. They take one angle, one facet only, and to quote an old Watchman line, when you could easily step back and look at the whole gem. And Apple has never been a market share dependent company. They made tons of money in recent years off a tiny little sliver of Mac profits. They were never dominant in phones. Nokia and BlackBerry had vastly more market share when they started. Android has vastly more market share now. Apple's business model is different than Google's in that they don't require market share in order to achieve profit share. So I just find it strange that that lesson is not applied, but then also carrying this over, we got all these stories about Google just did a Retina-like Nexus 7. Why hasn't Apple shipped a Retina iPad Mini? And a couple of things that struck me about that is, well, one, we're not in Apple's product cycle. They release in spring or fall. It's past spring. It's not fall yet. But also, the Nexus 7 is different in kind. It's a 1080p display. And while that has the same density as a theoretical Retina display iPad Mini, the iPad Mini actually uses a much larger display. It's 2048 by 1536, and when you do the math, that ends up being, the Nexus display is 3/4 the amount of pixels as what a Retina iPad Mini would need, and that's not a trivial difference, especially when you consider the Nexus 7 is thicker, so proportionally could have more battery than the iPad Mini has, and also it's got 9 hours of battery life, not 10 hours like the iPad Mini, and apparently, according to what some reports are saying, that's in airplane mode when none of the radios are on, where Apple's 10 hours are using Wi-Fi, and that math makes for an incredibly different formula. So I think it's odd that people would say, Google did it, Apple, why can't Apple, when Google didn't do anything of the sort?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, just because Google can do a thing, should Apple do something as well? I mean, the technical differences between the Nexus and what a hypothetical, theoretical iPad Mini would be notwithstanding. I hate this kind of comparisons because you can't glean how Apple's going to engineer something based on what its competitors do.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true, and I'm transitioning quickly here, but I want to get through a lot of stuff. That brings me to the third thing. This week, 9to5Mac found strings that suggested that there would be a spec-bumped iPad Mini this year. That would be basically the standard resolution iPad Mini, but with an A6 processor and maybe some other improvements on the internals. At the same time, the Wall Street Journal, I forget which reporter it was. Lorraine Luck from the Wall Street Journal said that according to component sources, Apple was readying a Retina iPad Mini. Some people said, quote unquote, in response to the new Nexus 7, and these were seen as conflicting rumors. But again, past behavior, current behavior, business model. We go back to when the iPad 3 was introduced, and there's always a price to pay for Retina. Retina is not free. The first generation, whether it's a Mac or an iPhone or an iPad, always has horrible compromises. Those pixels are not trivial to push, and Apple introduced a new iPad 2 to sell at the low end when they introduced the Retina iPad 3. So I'm not sure why these rumors are seen in conflict when Apple could either have a conservative and an aggressive prototype and decide which one to launch based on what's ready, or simply launch the Retina iPad Mini, which would not be a cheap tablet, and then have an improved iPad Mini 2, an iPad Mini like they had the iPad 2 at the low end.
Well, I want to take a step back for a moment and ask, seriously, what the point of an iPad Mini with Retina display is. I mean, I look at the iPad with Retina display and the iPad Mini side by side, and I'm hard-pressed to really notice the difference. I mean, okay, there's some difference if you're looking at photography.
Really small fonts.
Or really small fonts, yeah. If you're looking at very small typography, okay, there are some differences between the two machines. But the fact is, the iPad Mini scales down that full-sized iPad image so well that I think for a lot of customers, a large segment of Apple's potential customers for the iPad, the Retina display is not going to be a compelling reason for them to buy one, or for that matter, to upgrade an iPad Mini that they already have. There's got to be a lot more under the hood to an iPad refresh than just the Retina display. So I think that people who are making a big deal about the Retina display might be chasing windmills a little bit.
What interests me about that is back when the iPad 3 came out with the Retina display, Georgia, who previously co-hosted this show, now co-hosts Zen and Tech, got in so much shit for saying that she did not like it, that Retina was not important to her at all, and she would much rather have Apple made a better iPad 2 than the iPad 3. Just put all that performance into the iPad 2 at the standard resolution so it would fly, because she was a gamer. She wanted to game. And we've seen now that, developers will tell you the iPad 2 is still the highest performing iPad of the bunch. iPad 3 is horrible. That GPU was never great. Apple was really smart to replace it. And the iPad 4 is almost as good. But there's an argument to be made that you could have a fantastic, much cheaper, better performing iPad mini if you sacrifice the Retina hit. And I'm interested because, again, massive pushback when she said that. In hindsight, that wasn't such a ludicrous statement to make.
No, and I agree with her, and I think that the same exists for the iPad Mini. The iPad Mini is turning out to be an enormously popular device for a lot of people. People who may have started the tablet life with a Kindle or a Nook, for example, and are accustomed to that form factor. Other people for whom an iPad is just too bulky. Full-sized iPad, medical professionals, for example, really like having a tablet device to be able to look up drugs and check interactions and stuff like that, or look up patient records for some doctors' offices and hospitals that have decent EHR systems that will run on iPads, but don't necessarily want to be walking around with a 10-inch tablet all day. It's a lot of weight. They lose their hand. They can't slip it in a lab coat. And if for example, there are a ton of other use cases where the iPad Mini is just a better machine to have than an iPad. Now, that's not to discount the iPad entirely. I still use a full-sized iPad. I still prefer the full-sized iPad for a number of reasons. But I recognize full well that there is a great market for the iPad Mini. But, if Apple is tweaking improvements under the hood of the iPad Mini, and they're making improvements to processor speed, or if they're, boosting up the device's graphics performance, for example, or cramming other cool technology inside there, whether that's 802.11ac for Wi-Fi or whatever, I think that's a better use of resources than trying to cram a Retina display in there. I just don't see that Retina displays across the board, across all Apple products, are that necessary. It seems to me to be the cart leading the horse a little bit.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think what might happen, and this is speculation, is we might get that better iPad Mini standard to sort of make sure there's no umbrella left underneath. And I don't think it'll go as low as the Nexus 7's pricing, and that's we can talk about that after. But I do think that maybe there will be the Retina on the high end, because Apple is very good at taking money from people who want to spend a lot of money on high-tech Apple things, as we were talking about the Mac Pro, before the show. So I think maybe there's some duality there. But you bring up an excellent point. The Nexus 7 new is launching for $229, which is really cheap. And it was interesting to me because we often hear people say that Apple commoditizes their compliments by offering really cheap software. Like, there's been a race to the bottom, a lot of price pressure. Software on both the Mac a little bit, but mostly iOS, is incredibly cheap, and that benefits Apple because it means that there's much more interest in Apple hardware because you can get a lot of cheap software to go with it. And it looks like Google is continuing to apply that strategy to hardware, and they put pressure on the price of the device going down, for example, by subsidizing the Nexus 4 or the Nexus 7, because they make their money off the services. So the more people that have these devices, the better for Google. And Chris Umiastowski did a great article for us on what, if anything, that kind of price pressure does to Apple, who makes their money off hardware margins.
Yeah, and I think that trying to beat Apple at its own game is a dangerous business, but if you can do it, that certainly hits them where it hurts.
Yeah, and it's an interesting strategy because Google doesn't need that money. Apple does, I know you've been speaking for a while about how Apple's software and services business is building up, and that might buffer against smaller than traditional hardware margins. But for now, putting price pressure on Apple and hardware is incredibly smart because that's their traditional strength.
Right, exactly, and that, of course, is their Achilles heel. That is where they make the most of their money. So it stands to reason that there would be some weakness there, or some potential weakness for Apple. But there's also no question that Apple understands that. I mean, Apple used to say that services and software were kind of a break-even proposition for them, that they didn't want to lose money on it, but they weren't interested in making a lot of money because they were more interested in driving hardware sales instead. And I don't necessarily think that that's true anymore. I think that Apple recognizes that it can make some decent money off of software and services, and it wants to continue to do so, and it's going to have to continue to do so, just from the standpoint of trying to grow its own business.
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things that interests me the most about all this is that, Apple's been around a long time. They started with the Apple and the Apple II, and, that's been decades and decades, and they are an incredibly successful company still to this day, which is not something a lot of companies can say. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that, especially under the Steve Jobs administration and now with Tim Cook, they've held the line on the quality of product. And I don't want to say what Google is doing is dumping hardware. I know some people have said that. I don't know if it's that cut and dried yet. But when you look back over the course of history, people who have been willing to sacrifice quality and price, and the Nexus 7 is a good device. I'm not saying it's bad quality, but to use cheaper components or to subsidize the pricing to get more market share have not survived in the long term. Like you look at VHS tape manufacturers from the 80s when they dumped all that stuff to beat Sony's Betamax, and I'm dating myself horribly here, but then you look more recently at netbooks where everyone said Apple has to make a netbook. Apple's like, screw you, we're making the MacBook Air and the iPad, and we're maintaining our margins and innovating instead of racing to the bottom, and that those netbook makers destroyed their own business. They took all the money out of PCs, and I wonder if first companies don't learn this, and if we're going to see that in mobile, where it's great that Google's paying Asus for cheap products or paying whomever, LG or whatever, but I wonder if you devalue hardware, that ends up hurting manufacturers, and Apple will be just fine after.
Yeah. I guess the worst case scenario is that Apple takes it in the seat because people stop buying its products because its hardware is priced so absurdly high compared to the competition that nobody can really see the worth of it. The on the flip side of it is, manufacturers are going to continue to self-immolate like they have before when they try to come up with new ways of doing things that fail. As much as I want to disparage netbooks and sort of the fad that was netbooks and so on, I have to give credit where credit is due, and that is netbooks, first of all, helped establish a few manufacturers as significant players in the PC and peripherals market. I mean, who ever heard of ASUS before the EPC?
And now they're making the Nexus 7.
And now they're making the Nexus 7, exactly. So there's something to be said for that. So I think that there can be a kingmaker out of that sort of stuff for sure, maybe two. But increasingly these companies have to gamble in order to try to figure out a niche that they can exploit. And Apple's worked very well in the businesses that it's either competed in or built from the ground up, like tablets.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings us full circle back to Apple's iPhone business, which is their most profitable business. They make the most money off iPhones compared to anything else. And they're coming into the iPhone 5S, or whatever they end up calling it. But if we, again, look at past behavior for future behavior, every second year has been the tick-tock cycle, and we're in a talk cycle, which means similar casing design. And people complained nonsensically, but they complained it was boring last year. It's going to look very similar this year, and they're going up against the just announced Moto X we can talk about after, all the new Verizon Droids, which are very similar to the Moto X's, a conceivable Nexus 4 Part 2, and all the other handsets coming out. And Apple will probably have a better camera, probably a new camera feature, maybe some interesting new stuff with Siri. And the rumor is a fingerprint scanner, which will be a great demo, a great Santa Claus commercial in the Christmas. But I wonder if that pattern of one big release every 2 years is becoming predictable and easy to, well, not easy, but it's starting to get counter-programmed by the competitors.
Well, that has happened a number of times in Apple's past. I mean, remember when Apple pulled up stakes from Macworld Expo in New York, for example, when IDG made its ill-fated decision to bring the show back from New York to Boston. Apple said, no mas, that's it, we're done. And that ended up really killing that East Coast show altogether because Apple wasn't the only vendor to pull out. A lot of other vendors said, well, without Apple there, we're not going to be there. But it also got Apple out of this twice yearly product cycle that we had all grown accustomed to from well, really for years, but I think it was codified in the late '90s, especially after Jobs came back and once the iMac was introduced. We got used to big product announcements in San Francisco, in January, and then big product announcements mid-year. We saw the iBook introduced, we saw Airport introduced, we saw other products like that come out mid-year, and we got accustomed to thinking Apple is going to have something every 6 months, and that started to be reflected in their stock valuation. You would see their stocks sort of recede, in late June leading up to the show, and then July there'd be a rally as soon as the products were announced. Apple wanted to get out of that trap, obviously. It wanted to get out of that trap for a few reasons. I mean, showing in New York is an expensive place to do it. They didn't want to be beholden to another company's product cycle or another company's show cycle in order for their own product announcements. And they also had gotten to the point where they felt, I think justifiably, that they didn't have to have an appearance at a trade show like Macworld Expo in order to get the publicity that they were looking for their product announcements. But the tyranny of that cyclical sort of indication is there nonetheless. And I mean, we see that reflected in the way that Apple products are announced now. We know, or at least we suspect, that Apple is going to have some kind of event in September or October where it is in all likelihood going to introduce new iOS devices, because that's always been about the time of year that Apple revises its iPod line. And Apple's going to have some announcements going into the holiday season that it's going to want to get out. So there's a predictability to it. But Apple's also been fond of shaking the tree a little bit, too. I mean, remember last year when everybody was freaking out because the iPhone 5 didn't get announced when we thought it was going to get announced? We all expected it to happen in May, or, okay, well, it didn't happen in May. Maybe it'll happen at WWDC, and then, nothing at WWDC. And for 3 months, there was, gnashing of teeth and tearing of hair trying to figure out what Apple was going to do. Apple ended up going, 18 months?
Yeah.
No, 15 months.
15 months.
But in product cycles. So, Apple can shake the tree when it wants to as well and kind of break out of that cycle.
Or the double iPad release last year.
Or the double iPad release last year. Although, Rene, you seem to contend pretty strongly that that's because the iPad 3 was just a, red-headed stepchild that needed to be put down.
The iPad 4 solved a lot of problems for a lot of people, Apple developers and users.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so, I mean, if we start listening to the rumors about the fingerprint or thumb reader or whatever you want to call it, Applebot, Authentic, there's been a lot of speculation. There's been some mainstream reporting on it. We talked about Talk Mobile this week has been all about security and enterprise, and we talked about, first of all, it's such a pain in the ass to use security on mobile. To enter passwords in the first generation iPhone, when you couldn't even see the letters that you were putting in at all, was a nightmare because you'd get it wrong and you'd not know that you mistyped something. And software keyboards, for all their strengths, are not the most reliable input thing. And that's why there's damn you autocorrect. That's why there's the red underline now. And they've been fixing these things. They let you see the character briefly when you type it, but it's still not easy to enter a password, let alone a strong, unique password, which is the kind that you want to use on a mobile device that has all your contacts, all your friends, all your location, all your photos, all that stuff on it. And you've got password managers like 1Password or LastPass and stuff like that. But because there's no browser extensions and because they're sandboxed, they're just not as useful as they are on the Mac. So you have a huge amount of authentication problems, which leads you to either having a bad experience or just forswearing passwords, which is even worse, or making really easy to enter passwords, which is just as bad. And it seems like a thumbprint reader could solve those, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like, would you even use one? Would you use it in conjunction with a passcode? Would you just ignore it entirely?
Well, I think that Apple is on the right track with iCloud Keychain. They're trying to simplify the process. They understand that that security is important, that people need passwords, but people need to have a convenient way to use passwords as well. And there have been products like 1Password for years, but they're kind of fraught with idiosyncrasies that make them not the right solution for everyone. Plus, everybody has to know about them in order to use them and be willing to buy them, which is another hurdle. So it's good that Apple is doing things like iCloud Keychain, building it into the operating system, whether it's iOS 7 or Mavericks to make it easier to use. Biometrics are really cool when they work. They don't always work. They've gotten a lot better over the years, but they're still not foolproof. And, of course, we've all seen the hacker movies where, there's a retina scanner, so, somebody chops the dude's head off and uses his, skull to scan, or chops the dude's hand off, like in True Blood this past week, so they can get through the biometrically locked door. Whether or not that stuff actually works, so that's just a MacGuffin that we see in the movies. I don't think that people are going to start losing eyes and thumbs over their iPhones.
And blaming Apple, of course.
And blaming Apple, of course. I can just see the headlines, right? Apple's new security system causes blindness.
Creates Frankenstein's Secret Service agents.
That's exactly right. But, so, biometrics are great, but it's only part of an overall security, system. I don't think that there's a perfect system out there. I don't think there's a foolproof system either. So just keep experimenting and keep coming up with new things. But that whatever Apple does in terms of biometric security, if that is indeed the route that it goes, it's going to be...
Oh, I think we lost Peter for a second. We will see if he comes back. What makes me curious is whether or not that will be... we lost you, Peter. You're back.
I know I did. Well, my Retina scanner didn't work right.
The thing I was about to ask you was, because I said I could see the commercial, because Apple always takes whatever some of the fancier features are from a new product release, and that becomes the holiday season commercial, and I can see a little elf trying to go up to the new iPhone to find out what the Christmas presents are, touching the button, and login denied, then ho ho ho, and Santa picks it up, and suddenly he knows what all the kids are getting. And I think that's interesting from what could be a talk hardware cycle, but I also wonder if Apple then has to roll that out. Like if the new iPhone gets it, does the new iPad mini and the new iPad have to get it? Is it useful as a flagship feature, or does it have to be ubiquitous to make it consistent enough that people use it?
I think it does have to be ubiquitous enough that people... to get people used to it enough to use. I think that is definitely the case. And I think that any new technology that Apple introduces is going to trickle down to the rest of its products, to the rest of its product line sooner or later. We're seeing Thunderbolt 2 come out for the Mac Pro when the Mac Pro gets redesigned later this year. I make the point in the Thunderbolt versus USB 3.1 comparison that I just posted this afternoon, that there's no doubt that Thunderbolt 2 is going to be ubiquitous across the Mac platform by the end of next year. There's no question that Apple is going to be getting that stuff in just as quick as it can, across the product line, as soon as it makes sense. We've seen technology trickle from iOS into OS X. We've seen OS X technology trickle back the other way. If there's one thing that Apple is really good at and is better at than just about any other company out there, it is sort of integrating that user experience across multiple devices and across multiple platforms that it controls.
Yeah. So let's tangent to that, because that's interesting to me. And if we're jumping around too much, I apologize. There's just a lot to cover. So USB 3.1 is as fast as Thunderbolt 1. And Apple had FireWire before, and FireWire it did have some disadvantages, but in many ways it was faster and better, especially for people doing professional video or audio work, than USB. But USB eventually trounced it. Thunderbolt can do so many more things than USB. It can carry power, it can carry mini display. It's going to be twice as fast. But I wonder if USB 3.1 is going to have the same effect on it that it had on FireWire, and I ask specifically because, for example, Thunderbolt doesn't work on iOS devices because they're not PCI architecture. USB 3.1 currently is no advantage to iOS devices either because it'll saturate the flash storage speeds before it even gets to USB 3 levels. But I just wonder, Peter, do you think something like that will be ubiquitous enough that it'll hurt adoption of Thunderbolt?
Well, I first of all, let me say at the outset that I have no doubt that USB 3.1 is the heir ascendant for general purpose computer peripheral interfaces. I don't think that there's any question about it because it's backwards compatible with USB 3.0. It's backwards compatible with USB 2.0. You've got some regulatory organizations, some governments that require USB compatibility in devices like cell phones, for power, for example. So there's no question that USB is around and it's going to be here to stay. But the problem that I've got, the trope that I've seen repeated over and over again, is that USB 3.1 matches Thunderbolt's bandwidth. Objectively, that's true, but that's like saying the two-lane highway near your house that has a 65-mile-an-hour speed limit marker on it is the same speed limit as the four-lane highway that's 65 miles an hour. That part, that they may have the same speed limit, but you can get a hell of a lot more traffic on that four-lane highway, just like you can with Thunderbolt, because Thunderbolt is a four-lane technology. USB, even if in its 3.1 form, only has one lane up and one lane down. And what's more, it's much more CPU dependent in terms of traffic management than Thunderbolt is. So not only do you have 4 lanes versus 2, but you've also got much better traffic cops keeping an eye on things and making sure the traffic moves smoothly on Thunderbolt, on the Thunderbolt
freeway. To abuse
freeway.
your analogy, you can also have trucks and boats on that one and only cars on the other one.
That's exactly right, So, and flying saucers and magic carpets and everything else too. So, I'm sorry to kind of abuse the analogy a little bit, but I think that it's true. Thunderbolt is a more robust technology with better data throughput than USB 3.1 has. Having said that, I have no doubt that it's going to remain a niche technology. Intel just hasn't put its marketing muscle behind it like it did with USB. Intel is still building it into chipsets, but whatever. And the other thing about USB 3.1 is that we're not going to see any implementation of USB 3.1 until late in 2014. Mm-hmm. Thunderbolt 2 will be ubiquitous across the Mac platform by then, or pretty near ubiquitous across the Mac platform, and we'll have an enormous head start on that. So, whatever. I don't see a lot of devices, especially devices like hard drives, which are still dependent on serial ATA interfaces, to really have any tangible benefit from USB 3.1.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because a lot of times the news loses the context of the time, like when the story matters. It's an interesting technology story right now, but it's not really an end user story. And I want to dive back into security briefly for a second because one of my favorite movies, from a long time ago, was Sneakers, and they had famously C-Tech Astronomy, which ended up being an anagram for No More Secrets because someone had developed a box that could crunch big numbers so fast that it rendered every password moot so that you could break into any system, find out any information. And that was science fiction. That was Robert Redford and Ben Kingsley back then talking about that stuff. And now we're living in an era where, Nick posted a story earlier today. This Black Hat conference is going on this week, which is the hackers convention, and a guy showed off what looks like an iPhone charger, but you plug your iPhone into it, and it's secretly a little computer. And just like iTunes, it handshakes with your iPhone, and it can put fake applications onto your iPhone. The Developer Center was, famously down earlier. 2 weeks ago, it was down. Maybe a week and a half ago, it was down for over a week. And there have been exploits to all sorts of stuff. So the idea that Apple's investigating fingerprint stuff to me is interesting, but I don't have a sense of how it will affect our real lives yet. Like, for example, Peter, once I lock my iPhone with my fingerprint, can I still hand it to you, or can I hand it to my godson to play a game on? Can I lend it to somebody? If I have an iPad in an office, if I have an iPad in the house, how do I let different people log into it? And one of the things that Google did with the Nexus 7 and Android 4.3 is have multiple user accounts with different permissions per user account. And that is a definite layer of complexity, but when you start getting to tablet or family devices, I wonder if a case can't be made that Apple needs to investigate, along with new security, things like maybe a guest mode, like on the Mac, where it just boots into Safari, or maybe different user accounts on the iPad. I don't know.
Yeah, I would love to see different user accounts on iOS devices. That would solve a lot of problems, I think, for a lot of families. I don't know. I mean, remember Steve Jobs showing off voice passwords? My voice is my password a while back,
yep.
And nothing really ever seemed to come of that. So, I mean, even Bill Gates, was guilty of this. Bill Gates, I remember, what was it at CES a number of years ago, predicted that, by now we would all be talking to our computers and keyboards would be a thing of the past. So much for that.
Computer!
Oh, how quaint.
Well, what's interesting to me is that, and again, I'm drawing a lot of parallels to Google because they've been doing a ton of announcements in the last 2 weeks. They've done 3 events. They had the Nexus 7, they had the Droid events with Verizon, and today they had the Moto X event. And one of the signatures of both those droids and Moto X, and it's something that you wrote about previously with the Xbox One, is something called always listening. And previously we didn't have the battery capacity to do this. If you talk to turn-by-turn navigation companies, they'd say we can't just make a voice-activated turn-by-turn navigation thing because it would kill battery life. But the Xbox One is plugged in, fair enough. But the new droids, the new Moto X, it will listen to you. And if you say, "Okay, Google Now, what's the weather in New York?" Google Now will tell you that. And Google Now is a predictive engine, so it's already pre-fetched a lot of the things that it knows is in your area, on your schedule, habitual to you. And I wonder if that's going to be an area of interest to Apple. There was rumors last week that they'd brought on a lot of nuanced people in your hometown of Boston, Peter, to start doing more natural language things. And Siri's always sort of sat on top as a next generation interface over iOS. And I wonder if that always listening thing could start answering a lot of these problems, because it'll know your fingerprint. It could also know your voice. The Xbox One could maybe know multiple people's voices. You start getting into Apple's health technologies. They know your pulse. They know other biometric information from you, maybe because you're wearing the watch. And then it starts to, not be Jarvis yet, but it starts to me to be something that knows a lot, is much more familiar with you than anything like a simple passcode is today.
Yeah, and then the ultimate end of that is Hal from 2001 going insane and killing us all.
You could take an iPhone, Peter. I'm going on record as saying you could take an iPhone.
Well, it depends on how much of my house the iPhone was controlling, right? If my house was all of a sudden hermetically sealed and all the oxygen got sucked out, I would be toast. But seriously, I think that there is an upside and a downside to that, right? The upside is, these devices, when they're working properly and when they're designed effectively, really can make our lives a lot better and make things a lot more convenient for us. The downside of it is that it's technology that can be abused and exploited when it's in the wrong hands. Obviously that's a huge issue right now in the news in the United States with the NSA's PRISM program. And I think that that's one of the big fears that we hear repeated over and over again by people who are seeing the Xbox One as this device that's always on and always watching you. Wow, that's really kind of creepy to me. That's a little bit too more Big Brother than I really feel comfortable with. I don't necessarily think that I would have a problem with my iPhone recognizing my speech patterns, recognizing my individual timbre and my tone of voice, and knowing that that's Peter compared to Robert, my 18-year-old son, or Bonnie, my wife. But to what end? Where is this information being collected? How is that data actually being parsed, and who has access to it? Those are very real questions, very serious questions that need to be resolved in a clear and transparent manner, I think, for people to feel comfortable before it can really be widely adopted.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you, and it's something that I've repeated over and over again on different shows, that when we go to CES and we talk with Ford, they say, yeah, these cars can do anything, but it scares the shit out of people, and we have to be very careful to do one thing at a time. Like, we have to make it parallel park and then come find you, because if your car just was completely autonomous, people would be coming at it with blowtorches and pitchforks. And I think we're starting to get there in mobile, where it's no longer a matter of what the technology can do, but what consumers are willing to accept. And Leo Laporte made that comment on Talk Mobile as well. He's saying, these phones are doing so much already. Slow down for a second. Let consumers get used to it for a minute.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And the fact of the matter is that there's very little transparency. And, sorry to hop off tangentially again, but, we saw, for example, this past week, Apple attacked in the mainstream media about a report from China Labor Watch suggesting that one of Apple's suppliers, Pegatron, was abusing its employees. Pegatron is Apple is not Pegatron's only customer. In fact, the Google Nexus itself is made on a Pegatron production line. There are a lot of Pegatron or a lot of companies that use Pegatron for manufacturing out there. I think Microsoft's Xbox is one of them. the fact of the matter is it's easiest to draw the connection between Apple and Pegatron because Apple is a lot more transparent than a lot of companies are about its manufacturing processes and its supply line. You know exactly who it's buying components from. You know exactly where those manufacturing facilities are because it's public information because Apple makes it so. Well, Apple's one of the few companies to do that. Other companies are not nearly as transparent about their data collection and reporting activities. And you know whether this is something that needs to be tackled legislatively, or something that needs to be tackled from the grassroots, with consumers saying, no, wait a minute, you have to tell me what you're going to do with this technology before I'll put up with it. I think that those are issues that we're going to have to grapple with.
Yeah, and you kind of bring us full circle there too, because one of the interesting things about that Pegatron report is 2 or 3 times they mention workers assembling Apple's new plastic iPhone. I mean, you know, oops, in the report. And Apple no longer makes any previous plastic iPhones. The 3GS was discontinued when the iPhone 4 dropped to free, and it's clearly a new device, which Apple's probably not happy about having leaked in that manner. But it shows, going back to the original talk about Apple being beaten on price, that Apple has its own way of sort of filling those niches. The same way the iPad Mini is cheaper than the iPad, but it's by no means a cheaper budget tablet. It's manufactured magnificently. They're doing that with the iPhone, and they did that with the iPod originally, introducing the iPod Mini and then the iPod Nano and then the iPod Shuffle, and they had a lot of stiff price-based competition at the time. And I think there'll always be a market for people for whom price is the primary feature, who get something other than Apple. But I find it interesting that Apple is willing and able to make high-quality, well-manufactured, pretty reliable products at lower price tiers without dropping their own internal margins at the same time.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think we were talking about this with Mark Gurman last week. You know, and it's clear that Apple has sacrificed some bottom line, you know, to be able to produce those products. No question that the iPad Mini's success has eaten into Apple's profit margins on iPads because Apple's not making as much money on the iPad Mini as it does on the full-size iPad. So I guess we'll see where the iPhone 5C or whatever it's ultimately called, or whatever Apple ultimately comes out with, where that goes. Whether or not that's truly a low-priced iPhone for the masses, or you know, just something that's manufactured in a different way to give Apple you know, a little bit more broad base of interest for its products than what it had before. Still anybody's guess.
One of the interesting comments I saw on iMore is that, you know, Apple overcharges for these devices, and I always find that interesting. And there's a case to be made that other companies certainly have lower profit margins on their devices, and Apple could bring their profit margins down. But it's interesting to me that in capitalist societies, companies get accused, like it was called the Apple tax, famously. Like Apple's job should not be to make money or not to make so much money, when, you know, you wouldn't enjoy it if your boss paid you 1 cent over what your expenses for the year was. And I always thought the best way to get revenge on Apple if you weren't happy about their prices was to buy Apple stock, because then the dividend you get back would replace the money you gave them in profit, as long as you managed it correctly. So, you know, I'm fine with Apple charging a lot. If they charge too much, I'll just buy something else. I don't begrudge them charging a lot. I'll just find ways of, you know, making money off of them so that, you know, at the end, I'm hopefully net positive.
Exactly right. You know, I've always thought the Apple tax was kind of a stupid idea. You know, is there a BMW tax, or is there a, you know, living in the nice suburb tax? I guess that there is, but it's a tax that the consumers who buy these products are willing to pay.
I mean, look at Exxon profits, right? Is there a I put gas in my car tax?
Yeah, there sure is. You know, state, federal, local levels, unfortunately. The bottom line is that, you know, in a capitalist society, which is ostensibly what we're still living in, you know, companies are allowed to charge, you know, reasonable markups for what they think their products are worth. And that's all in the eye of the consumer, as long as they're not gouging the consumers. You know, if Apple were charging some outrageous price because nobody else made a cell phone and they were the only ones who had it, then I'm sure the feds would step in and regulate it somehow. But in the interim, you know, if Apple says that an iPhone is worth $650, that's what you are going to pay for it, regardless of what you think it's worth. And if you don't think it's worth, there are other fish in the ocean. You know, you can go off and buy a Lumia, you can go off and get a BlackBerry, you can get, you know, a billion different Android phones, or you can just get a dumb phone and not get charged a lot of money for it. You don't have to buy an Apple product if you don't want one. So if you don't think it's worth the money, shut the hell up and move on.
Well, I think that's where the market self-regulates, though, is that if enough people don't buy Apple goods because they believe that the price is too high or some other factor is not to their liking, then Apple realizes it has a market opportunity for lower-cost devices like the iPad mini, like the iPhone 5C if they end up shipping that, like the iPod Shuffle. So it ends up benefiting everybody. If there is an umbrella underneath it, Apple is either forced to address it or, like with computers, choose not to address it, which opens up the market. Like if you want a netbook, Apple will not sell it to you, so you have to get that from somebody else, and Apple is happy not to have you as a customer rather than make a netbook. And everything is a choice. Google will subsidize Nexus products because they want you to use their services, and for some people that's not a great deal. Some people think that time is more valuable than money. Other people think their data or their privacy, or they don't like Google's model or Amazon's model, and that is more valuable than money. So they will gladly give Apple more money up front in order for them to leave them alone later. And I get in trouble for using this analogy, but to me it's like a date. Like when I have a date with Apple, I feel like I can leave and there's no expectations afterwards. When I have a date with Google or Amazon, it feels like they bought me a lobster dinner and they're kind of staring at me afterwards. And for some people that's fine. They have no problem with that. They'll either enjoy the after party or they'll get up and leave. I don't like having that feeling of expectation, so I'd much rather pay my money, get a shiny box, and leave than be in a barter services relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from a different perspective. I'm a lowly tech journalist. I'm not. I don't have my own personal mint. I don't come from money, so I have to pretty carefully budget the devices that I get for myself and my family. And, from my perspective, I still find the Apple stuff to be a better value than much of the competition. But that also means that I can't buy the same products that I would like to get, or that everybody in my house would like. Whether that's the latest iPhone or whether that's the latest computer. I mean, sometimes we have to make do with last year's model. Sometimes we have to make do with hand-me-downs from one another because we're trying to stretch the budget, because Apple does charge a premium for its stuff. But in the end, if you think the user experience is worth it, and I do, then that pays off in the long run. But sometimes it does mean tightening your belt a little bit or readjusting your priorities to make sure that you do get the things that you need.
I think it's a fascinating subject, and I think as Android continues to grow and as people like Microsoft and BlackBerry and others try to figure out how to compete with both Apple and Google, we'll see the market continue to mature. I mean, smartphones are becoming increasingly everyday phones, but we're not there yet. Tablets are becoming increasingly part of the PC market, but it's not the whole market yet. And that's going to change. I do want to transition a little bit before we finish, Peter, and ask you what's going on in gaming this week. What are the hot new titles, and what are you looking at?
Well, on my my iPad, I've sort of been all consumed with Deus Ex: The Fall, which I've been playing for weeks, and I haven't been playing every day for weeks, but as I've gotten the free time, I've been playing it. It's a fantastic game. Really happy to report that Square Enix did the right thing, and they removed an issue that was apparent with the initial release that prevented you from firing any weapons in it if you had jailbroken your device. I don't jailbreak my iPad, so I hadn't noticed this particular problem, but this came up almost immediately afterwards. They realized they had kind of a PR disaster on their hand and backpedaled from it really quickly. So they offered an update that fixed that. If you take a look over on the Mac App Store, there are a couple of new releases that are worth talking about. One of them is Tropico 4 Gold Edition, which is the Mac installment of a sort of a city-building, empire-building game that puts you in charge of a banana republic, a dictator, sort of a Fidel Castro-like dictator. You can either create sort of a Caribbean tropical paradise, a tourist mecca, or you can try to become a serious world power if you want. There's also a really crazy game that I've seen played a lot that is just grotesque and hilariously fun, and it's also ridiculously difficult. It's called Surgeon Simulator. Surgeon Simulator 2013 is the name. It costs you $10, and it challenges you to complete a heart transplant with only rudimentary tools available. And honestly, tearing your patient apart and killing them is part of the fun. It sounds bizarre, but it's ridiculously fun. A ton of cool games over at the Steam store that are worth checking out. If you don't already go to it, check out Steam. And have a look in the Mac section because they're coming out with new stuff all the time. Not only from Valve, which is the company that owns Steam and of course publishes terrific games like Left 4 Dead 2 and Half-Life 2, but all of Valve's partners, which includes some of the same titles that you will find in the Mac App Store. And I'd like to make a recommendation to anybody who is comparing games that they're looking at in the Mac App Store to elsewhere. Compare them on the Mac App Store and Steam. If you can get it at Steam for the same money, I swear it's worth it to get it through Steam than it is to get it through the Mac App Store, because you may be paying the same money for it, you're getting the same binary, but you'll often get things like ladders and achievements and stuff like that that you won't get through the Mac App Store, and you usually get Steam Play as well. So if you end up playing your games on a PC at some point or another, you won't have to pay for them again. You can just download your PC games for free.
Yeah, no, that is Steam is a terrific value. Steam is one of those things that makes me angry I don't have more time to play more Steam stuff.
Yeah, same here.
In terms of apps, I mentioned it on MacBreak Weekly this week, so I won't get into it too deeply, but DJ2 has launched. It is the sequel to DJ, which is Algorithm's Apple Design Award-winning DJ application, and it literally has turntables on it, and you can scratch like you're Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. And the original the original DJ was so good that even I could use it, and I have no musical talent whatsoever. DJ2 takes it to an entirely new level. And that's just one of the several fantastic releases that came out last week. Since it's Security Month, Ali did a roundup of password apps to try to figure out what's the best and for whom. She also did mileage tracker apps. So make sure you go to imore.com/apps and you can see all the new stuff that has come out this week. I wanted to mention something in terms of media, Peter. I usually buy... I still use the big iPad for one main thing. I watch movies on it sometimes, but I use it for comic books because it's more like the size of a real comic book, and I like reading comics much better on the big iPad. And I rebought Warren Ellis's Planetary over the weekend because I wanted to read it again for something else that I'm working on. And I also wanted to gift it to a friend of mine so that we could discuss it later. And iBooks still does not have gifting, and they have gifting for music, they have gifting for apps, but not for books. So I had to go to Kindle and gift it via Amazon. So now he has it in Kindle, I have it on iBooks. And I just wish that would, I don't know what's holding Apple up, whether it's them or the publishers, but that would be a really handy feature. And sorry.
No, go on.
Now, I was going to say, if you haven't read Planetary yet, it's by Warren Ellis, who's fantastic British writer, very future-focused. He did the Iron Man Extremis story that the Iron Man 3 movie was largely based on. And Planetary is it's a 27-issue miniseries that took them 10 years to do. So it was like 2.7 issues a year. And it basically is the secret history of the world. It's like archaeologists are digging through everything from Frankenstein to Tarzan to Sherlock Holmes to Zorro to Superman to Miracle Man to Sandman and the entire history of pulp fiction and comics as if it were one giant sinister plot throughout history. And if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. I'm going to make it my media pick of the week next week, so Peter will have a link up to it. But check that out, and I do like iBooks better as an interface, but the Kindle gifting, Peter, put me over the edge.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about having the iPad, and this is the same thing about having the Mac, right? You can install Windows on a Mac easily. You can't install Mac OS on the PC without Hackintoshing it. The same sort of parallel exists in the ebook world. It's great that you've got these different choices, on the iPad, so you can either use iBooks or you can use Kindle or you can use Nook even if you wanted, but you're not beholden to one particular platform, although there are some things to recommend iBooks. Rene, in terms of your head scratching over why Apple hasn't done more with iBooks, my assumption has been that the whole regulatory brouhaha between Apple and the publishers really kind of put the brakes on Apple doing any kind of significant change to the way that iBooks works. I'm hoping that once iBooks is available on the Mac, we're going to start seeing incrementally Apple making some improvements to iBooks, because clearly there's some real deficiencies that it has to compete with Amazon and even potentially with Barnes and Noble, assuming they're still around in a year.
They were way ahead, right? I mean, when they first launched, they had rich media content beyond anything the Kindle format even supported, and they were available in way more countries, but they've kind of, like you said, not done much with it, and now Kindle's got their new format, much more competitive, and they're still rolling out into new places, and it's becoming more international as well.
It's absolutely true, but the fact that you can gift, quote unquote, somebody your Kindle book and can't do it to iBooks kind of demonstrates, I think, just how deficient the entire ebook market really is. This is why I'm much more inclined to buy books from companies like Tor that support EPUB or PDF formats that aren't DRM laden than I am inclined to do business with anyone else that sticks their books in a proprietary format. I mean, for God's sake, it's a book. It's a medium that's been around for thousands of years of human civilization, and it's only in the last 5 years that the publishing market and the software development market have colluded to screw it up into an unrecognizable mess, and it really kind of makes me sick.
They finally had their opportunity, Peter. They've been waiting all these years.
It's true, they have been, and now they've done it. Now they've gone and messed it all up for the rest of us.
Which is why we can't have nice text.
Exactly right.
Peter, I know this, and I know a lot of people know that, but in case anyone is watching or listening to the show today and does not yet know where to find you, where can they look?
On Twitter, @Flarg, Flargh. I'll warn you that I'm not safe for work and often profane. So if you don't like that sort of stuff, go away.
But you introduced to me the idea of Pacific Rim as a Godzilla movie today, so you are well worth a follow.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, no, absolutely. That link was hilarious. I absolutely love it. I've got to give my friend Daniel Drew Turner a hand for pointing that my way. So Flarg at Twitter, also on app.net, at iMore, and occasionally on the loopinsight.com.
And you can find me at Rene Ritchie. You can also find me on iMore.com. You can find all of our shows at mobilenations.com/shows. We did launch a new show a couple weeks ago. It's called Vector. The first show had John Siracusa talking about the Xbox One. The second show had Guy English talking about the new Mac Pro. We have another show in the can, so that'll be released, I believe, later on today, so make sure you look for that. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, everyone in the chat room. You guys are absolutely fantastic, and we will see you next week. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Rene. See you next week.